Okay, I believe the recording has started. So let me just do an introduction into myself before we get going. So, many of you probably know this, have known me for a while, but essentially, Alim Ozcan, I have over 25 years of experience in the service management operational realm, as well as program project delivery. So I've been doing this for a long time for a lot of organizations, which you may have heard of, such as Barclays Bank, HSBC, Deutsche Bank. So there's some of the financial organizations, as well as Network Rail, and primarily in the UK, but also abroad as well. I've done work for Kuwait Oil Company as an example. So a lot of experience in different fields, which I hope to bring to this session. A lot of my work has primarily revolved around business change improvements, around people, process, and tools. And as I hope you'd expect, I am qualified at the highest levels in ITIL 4, V3, V2, and I was also involved in some of V1. So for a long time in ITIL, and then some other qualifications that help as well, such as ISO 20000, etc. So just a plug for some of the groups that we have. So many of you are a member of the Mentoring Professional Slack group. There's a URL there. Again, these will all be shared with you afterwards anyway. We also have a Mentoring Professionals LinkedIn page, which again, many of you are following. That's where we'll upload the PDF of all of the presentations, not just my one, but all of them. And then we also have a YouTube channel where all of the video recordings will be posted. And finally, it's not just me, right? So just as, if you thought it was just me, then I have a brother and a sister who are also ITIL experts. So we've been doing this for a while now, trio, but, many other mentors and other people who are obviously involved and are bringing the presentations that you've been enjoying and bring them to you. So that's who I am. Hopefully that fills you with confidence in terms of my credibility. So let me go on to this next slide. So what you're seeing in front of you, which I had to cover, are essentially the things that you filled in as what you were expecting to get from this presentation. So if you remember when you were registering, there was one question: do you have any outcomes? What do you expect, etc. And this is over 100 people registered, and essentially I've summarized it down into this, and you'll see there are 4 rows, okay? Now, the one that we are actually covering, what this presentation is about, is the one with the big tick in the middle, which is all about digital IT strategy, okay? That's what the majority of you have said you're here for, which is great. But you have also said, if you see in the first row, 15 or more of you said you want to see the differences between ITIL 4 and V3. So because of that, I'm covering it briefly, right? To make you happy, I'm covering it. But essentially, that's a different presentation I did a few weeks ago. It's available on YouTube, so you can go and look at that presentation if you want, the link I mentioned. But to appease you, I will cover it briefly, just so you see the differences between ITIL V3 and 4. But that's not a core part of this presentation. Okay, so quite a few of you also said that you want to understand the certifications, ITIL certifications, this certification, etc. Again, apologies, but I won't use this session to go through certifications and training courses. But my sister Fatma, who I mentioned earlier, is doing a presentation tomorrow, where ITIL 4 certifications in particular are being covered. So if you haven't done so already, please register for that session. I'll be on that one as well. So any of your certification type questions we'll cover then. And before I come back to the middle row, so the last row, you'll see these are things that you also said that apologies, but I won't be able to cover. These are more general ITIL type stuff. So, all good content. Thank you for filling in, but this is probably for a future ITIL presentation. Things like how can ITIL be used in DevOps. You see here CIs, a lot of stuff on DevOps, Agile, and I'll touch on it briefly because some of digital IT strategy is relevant, but they're not things that I will cover in any detail. I won't stay on this digital IT stuff here for too long, because actually you'll see it in the presentation slides as we go through it. But essentially, that's what you said you wanted to see. That's essentially what we'll be covering. Okay. So this is the what's different between V3 to V4, or 4, I should say. And for those of you that attended my presentation a few weeks ago, you would have seen this slide anyway, so I've reused this. But just as a refresher, I'll go over it. So ITIL 4 released in February 2019, as you can see. There are 34 ITIL practices in 4, and whereas in ITIL V3 there were 26 processes. And in one of the slides coming up, I will go into what those 34 ITIL 4 practices are. So you'll see a diagram of that in a bit. But essentially, let me cover why are we saying practices now, whereas we've always known it as processes. You know, I'll touch on that. Practices, what ITIL 4 is just trying to do is just show that it's a bit wider than just the inputs, activities, and outputs that you get from a process. It's also the tools that you use around those processes, the resources that you use, the capabilities, etc. So it's just a technical term, you know, it's just a word change, just see it like that. Many of you who were using ITIL V3 processes and are still using ITIL V3 processes, of course, you're using the tools and the skills and the capabilities along with it. So don't get too confused or worried about if you see practices, processes, etc. For most of you, it actually means the same thing. But there are 34 practices, as I said, which we'll go through. There are also now 7 guiding principles in ITIL 4. And what's behind these is essentially saying that whatever you're doing, whatever you're considering, always, at least at the very minimum, consider these guiding principles. You don't have to do them all, but definitely, you know, focus on value, always focus on value. And before you throw everything out of the window, start where you are. Look at what you've got already before you make any changes. And I won't go through each of them, but you'll see there are 7 guiding principles in ITIL 4. There are also 4 dimensions, which you'll hear. And again, what I found in speaking with some people, that there are sometimes confusion around what do you mean by 4 dimensions? I'm not sure. And they look at the diagram that you'll see here. Essentially, think of the 4 dimensions as just like you would have done always: people, process, systems. And the one maybe addition that you don't often refer to are your partners and suppliers. Okay, but they're essentially the 4 dimensions that are brought out in ITIL 4. So very quick summary there for some of the differences. And then I mentioned to you that I would cover the 34 practices. So you see them in front of you. And what I've done is essentially highlighted the ones in yellow where there are some significant differences between ITIL V3 and ITIL 4. But I won't have an opportunity in this session to go into them. As I said, I've done that in a previous session. I'm just showing you those differences here. Okay. And if you do, you know, I've mentioned it already, if you do have questions on any of these that you want me to pick up later on any of the slides, please post it in the chat window and we will cover it in the Q&A. Okay, I think my last slide on the differences between ITIL V3 and 4 is this one. And again, many of you may have heard of the service value system, service value chain, value streams, some of this terminology. And what I wanted to do with this slide is essentially simplify what that's getting to. Because again, I think I've seen that there's a lot of confusion out there when people are talking to me. Just think of the service value system, as you see in the first bullet point, essentially a replacement for this ITIL logo that you'll all be familiar with, which covers strategy, design, transition, operation, and CSI. So it just replaces that, but it's very, very similar. And the reason it's very similar is because in the second bullet point, you'll see there that actually it still has strategy in terms of engage and plan, still has design, it still has transition, you know, just like the service, the V3 lifecycle did. It still has build, so do some kind of implementation, and then of course deliver and support it, operate it, and finally improve it, just like you see in the diagram on your right in the service value chain. So yeah, there are some differences, but the key thing that ITIL 4 is trying to highlight in comparison to V3 is that you have to focus on value, and in particular the co-creation of value with everyone, all of your stakeholders. Now again, in ITIL V3, many of you were probably doing that, but all they've done in ITIL 4 is emphasize that that's core to what you should be doing in terms of providing your service management. I think, yes, I think that's the refresher on ITIL V3 to 4. I won't take any questions on that, but if you do have some, add it in the chat and I'll cover it later. This is really the core of the presentation now, what we are covering. Essentially this course, if you've seen this diagram before, this session is on the digital and IT strategy course, which will be released by Axelos. I think the plan was perhaps November 2020, but now because of what's going on in the world, perhaps it's going to be released in 2021, early 2021. I was lucky enough to be selected to go on the Axelos beta program, where I was essentially testing the course, the content, etc. I did sign a NDA, a non-disclosure agreement, unfortunately, where I can't actually show you any of the content from the actual material. But what I've done is essentially put in my own, so the slides you'll see next are what my interpretation of the content is, in my own words, so I'm not doing anything wrong, and you'll see essentially the key concepts that were covered in that digital and IT strategy. So I'll do two things now in the following slides. I'll cover the content from this course, and you know some of you may want to do that course in the future, and I'll also try and bring some real life examples of how you use digital now, right? And hopefully just to bring it to life for you. Okay, so that's what we are doing. So let's cover some of the key concepts. So I hope you would all agree that digital is changing the world. The way we work, you know, now we're all working from home, or many of us are working from home, or even if you're not working, you're having these Zoom sessions, etc. The way we communicate, and the way we think, the way we behave, where we are now in comparison to 10 years ago, 20 years ago is completely different. And 20 years ago, we were talking about the paperless office, for example, whereas now, because of the technology we're using and how we're working, it's more true than ever before, right? So whether you have an iPad, your phone, your Samsung phone, or your iPhone, or the laptop, it's rare that you need to actually print anything. And of course, technology such as Zoom, we no longer have to meet face-to-face necessarily. It's just as effective to do these kind of sessions remotely. And then Slack that we use, I mentioned Slack for the mentoring professionals. Some of you might be using Microsoft Teams. And then of course, just to bring it into the home, things like Netflix and Spotify. So I'm sure, many of you will remember that chain that's no longer exists, Blockbuster, right? It was everywhere. So that's gone. So they were, you'd have to go into a store, get your VHS tape. That's all history with the evolution of digital. And of course, Spotify, smart homes. I've even put TikTok here because, many of you might have seen these 15-second video clips communicating something to you, just as effective as Twitter and some of these other technologies. So everything, the way we work is changing. So in terms of digital IT strategy, really it's a mindset change for an organization. So whether you're a leader, whether you're a practitioner, it's about looking at technology and capabilities that can help you differentiate or perhaps disrupt a market, whether it's in your organization or in your industry. That's really what digital and IT strategy is about. And as I've got some examples here from Amazon. If you remember, Amazon started off where they just wanted to sell books and have an online bookstore. But now they'll sell cars, they'll sell furniture, they have shopping, your groceries. So that's a complete ecosystem disruptor, as you know, an amazing example of what Amazon have done. Whereas other examples are disruptors in an industry or a market, such as Uber, you know, taxi drivers, Airbnb, etc. And you'll see I've even put an iPhone here, you know, the technology of your phone, because that's also a huge ecosystem disruptor in that I don't think I've used the Post-it note in years, because I just capture the Post-it note type information I want on the phone. And if I want to pass it on to someone, then I'll WhatsApp them. And it's replaced cameras. Organizations like Kodak no longer really exist. And of course, the way we listen to music as well, and it's all digital, right? So these are some of the things that have come about in terms of digital, and perhaps what you need to consider for your area of work. So more key concepts. Digital in terms, and we'll see a slide on this later, but essentially when you're looking at a digital strategy, what's in the course content is that you have to think of your vision. So you have to, you know, decide what it is that you want to do, what your current state is, so that as is, where you want to get to in your to be, what the gap is between the as is and the to be. So how big is that gap? Is it really, really wide, what you need to cover? Or actually, is it just small changes that you need to do? Then the implementation, of course, of making those changes. And then doing an assessment as to, are we there yet? So have we achieved what we need to do? And just like you have in the CSI model, just keep going. So continual improvement. I mean, that's the core of digital strategy. I mentioned that I'd cover Agile, DevOps, and Scrum. So it is about doing things faster and more dynamic as well. So a lot of what's in the course content and what you would do with the digital strategy is working with technologies such as, or using frameworks and methodologies such as Agile, DevOps, and Scrum to bring about those changes, in that we can't wait 6 months, 1 year to see some outcome or output from a project. We may need to pilot something, do it, you know, in 4 weeks, 8 weeks, show what we're doing, see if it works before we then build on it and build on it and build on it. Another key concept is the digital organization versus the digital business. So an example of this for a digital organization might be a traditional bank, but where they have an online app, some online presence. In the UK, Barclays have Ping It, for example, where you can transfer money from one person to another. So it's still a traditional bank, but they have some online tools. Whereas a digital business is one which is just completely built on digital. And you know, they try and do away with paper, buildings, etc. It's just a digital organization. In terms of another key concept, if you're introducing digital to your organization, you need a balanced approach between focusing on the customer and the customer value, the customer journey, and the operational excellence that you're providing. And therefore, it shouldn't be one or the other, because if it's all focused on the customer, but your internal operations can't keep up with the delivery that you're doing, then of course, you know, whether it's a security issue that you'll have, can't keep up with capacity, you know, whatever it might be, you could suffer from. So you definitely need a balanced approach there. Another key concept that came out loud and clear in the course is that innovation and research and development should be encouraged at all parts of the organization, not just in a centralized research and development team. And because you'll have people with creative ideas, passion, drive in every aspect of your organization. So some mechanism to bring that out from people, recognize it, and utilize it in some way, as I said, should be encouraged in all areas. Okay, so I may stop there. I'll just go on to the next slide. Before I go into the core practices that are for the ITS, let me see if there are any questions that have come up that I should cover. Kerry, is there anything that's key?
So let me just have a quick look for you. Okay, so going back right to the very start, one question that did come up, not exactly ITIL related. What's the difference between mentoring professionals and best practice consulting? That was from Vikas.
Okay, so I can cover that. So yeah, as you said, not ITIL related, but let me just answer it. So best practice consulting is my company that I've had for 12, 13 years. So best practice consulting, as the name says, does consulting, does training or sales training courses, etc. Whereas mentoring professionals is an entity that I started about 4 or 5 months ago with approximately 30 mentors providing mentorship to like-minded people. We currently have about 400 people on that mentoring professionals group. It's completely free, nothing to do with making money, as you know, best practice consulting is. So I hope that answers your question. Any other questions, Kerry?
There's one from Mohammed. It's not a question. Maybe Mohammed, so that could be something that you might discuss in the Q&A right at the very end. So it was about one of the modules due to be released in H1 2020. So a little bit of discrepancy there, and maybe that's something for a one-to-one. Okay. And Michael as well, Michael Imhoff. Again, maybe that's something you can have a quick discussion with afterwards regarding what is in the publication and what is in the training.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Kerry. So this slide then, here, so you saw earlier on, I mentioned there are 34 practices. Well, the DITS course primarily focuses on these 7, okay? So I won't read them out, but it's the ones with the ticks. And if you're familiar with ITIL, you know, so if you've been involved in ITIL for a while, you'll see that these are primarily to do with strategy and design type processes in comparison to ITIL v3, right? So that's where you would have seen them. There are some new ones as well, such as workforce and talent management. And the next slides will provide a brief description of each of these. So you'll see what these are about. But that's what this course is primarily on. It's about the strategy and the design of what you should be doing in an organization in terms of digital, okay? And your focus on changing your organization, disrupting the market using digital technologies and the mindset and the capabilities that you have around that. And so, of course, you'll have to manage the risk. You'll have to do measurement and reporting. The finances are a big deal, of course, and the portfolio of well, you'll see in the next slides what each one of these covers. So I'll just move on. Okay, so I won't read each of these out, but I'll leave them on screen so you can have a brief read. But this slide and the next slide covers these 7 practices. Many of these are quite self-evident in terms of what they cover. Let me just see if there's any that needs an extra few words from me. So architecture management, of course, is about covering the architecture that will underpin your digital strategy. Portfolio management, as you see, is around programs, projects, and products. Portfolio management in the past, in ITIL v3, was primarily around your service portfolio. So what's in the pipeline, what you have right now as your service offerings, your live services, and then what you're retiring. Whereas in ITIL 4, portfolio management is wider, where it covers, as you see, programs, projects, and the products as well. Let me move on to the next slide. So workforce and talent management, that's quite an interesting one. If you're not familiar with ITIL 4, just to be aware of, in that in your organizations, when you are using ITIL v3, v2, etc., of course, workforce and talent management was occurring, but perhaps it mainly happened from the HR, human resources department. Now there's a practice on this because it's, of course, so key within the IT organization, or the organization utilizing ITIL with regards to the skills, the knowledge of people have, how you have succession plans, develop them, etc., the recruitment. So a whole practice on that. And the others, measurement and reporting and risk management, you'll be familiar with. But I'll just also emphasize risk management to say that that practice actually has quite a big weighting and a big focus in this DITS course, because a lot of what you do around your digital strategy is, of course, looking at managing risk as well. So what are the threats out there? What are the opportunities? And how you mitigate them, how you build upon them, etc. So quite a big focus on risk management. So some of your questions that you posted when you were registering for this session was actually on undertaking a digital transformation. So, you know, whether you are a leader or I mentioned innovation and R&D can happen from anywhere. It's the activities that any of you might want to consider with regards to transforming. It doesn't have to be a big transformation. It could also be incremental. But I've posted the bullet points here of all the things that as a very minimum you should consider. And many of these, of course, you will want to define and do a bigger piece of work on to ensure that your whole digital transformation looks at every angle, that it's holistic. Okay, so let me just focus on a few of these rather than reading each one out. You can obviously read them on your screen, but the key ones here are the mindset I mentioned. So if the organization, and some of you have perhaps worked in organizations like that, if the organization is a very historic, been around for a while type organization, perhaps 100 years, 50 years, for some of these organizations, it might be quite difficult to change the mindset from how they're doing business right now to focusing on digital. But I'm sure many of you have also experienced that a lot of these organizations that were staples of any economy, any high street, or many of these organizations actually no longer exist. And I'm sure you can all think of different examples. And you know, in the UK, for example, there was a chain called Woolworths, which no longer exists because they just didn't transform. And organizations like Amazon and others, where they were digital, have obviously taken business away from them, that they're no longer around. So that's key. Then the leadership and governance, and there's a big part of the course which focuses on the leadership skills that you need. They're quite generic in the course I found, but for you and your consideration, of course, if you're thinking about leadership skills for digital, let me give you one example that I would be looking for in a leader, either in terms of my peers or if I was recruiting someone, and that would be someone who perhaps uses digital media to communicate with. So whether it's dashboards, Zoom, etc., is probably the way you would want someone to go, rather than someone traditionally always wanting face-to-face meetings, as an example. I'm not saying face-to-face meetings won't be necessary and that it won't be good, but someone's focused on digital and 100% focused on digital, then you'd expect them most of the time to be using digital technology. What else is here? I'll focus on the tool systems, the optimize and automate. So you may have missed it, but one of the guiding principles, remember I mentioned there were 7 guiding principles, such as start where you are, look where you are, and one was optimize and automate. Others are think holistically, etc. But the optimize and automate one is quite a big push in digital, in that I've worked in many places where if something is too costly to try and automate, then you might still accept that you have a person, half a person, half the time of a person doing a task manually, such as new joiners. So leavers, joiners to an organization. You might have someone doing it manually, right? Because it's just too costly to automate, too complex. Whereas a big push in digital, of course, is no, spend that cost. Obviously, it still has to add value. It still needs to provide a return on investment, but really just try and automate and script as much as you can, so you don't have to have manual interventions, manual interactions where you can automate. So that's a big push. Partners and suppliers I mentioned before. Parallel operating models, if I can touch on that one. So if you you're in an organization right now and you have the operating model. So let's just take an IT department as an example. So or it could be the wider business. You're operating the way you are, and you are looking at digital technology, or you're embracing digital technology, bringing changes. It's going to impact your operating model. So it's going to impact how you communicate with your customers. So whether you use chatbots, etc. So you may need to run 2 operating models in parallel, whether it's for a short time or much longer. You might decide to always have 2 operating models. So you have one set of people working on the more traditional services you're providing, and then a complete new set of people working on your digital products. So that, can happen. But whichever model, whichever way you introduce it, at some point you'll at least need, as I said, 2 operating models, and the course goes into quite a lot of detail on that. It calls it cannibalism, so where you cannibalize one operating model and you make do, you get rid of what you've got now and you have the new operating model ASAP, and others are where you run them in synergy, etc. And then the last bullet point I'll mention, which is PESTLE and SWOT, which some of you will be familiar with. So political, economical, sociological, technological, legal, and environmental. And then the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. These are tools, and there are many out there, that when you're considering your digital transformation, you should look at in terms of doing the analysis as to what you're trying to achieve and whether it's right for your organization, such as what are the strengths of your current organization or the technology that you are looking at. So the items in yellow we had covered in an earlier slide. I was going to go back to it, but I won't. But you remember I mentioned about the vision, the as is, the to be, the gap, the implement, are we there yet, and keep going, the continual improvement. So some of the questions, the outcomes you wanted to hear about were, well, how do you start your digital transformation? So I wanted to give you some words around that, some areas for you to think about. And again, rather than reading each bullet point, I want to focus on some of the key ones that you need to consider, such as the assessment of the as-is. So I've had people say to me, well, but how do I do that? So there are some tools in the course, but things that you'll also be familiar with, like maybe the CMMI maturity model type of assessment. You can find documents on Google if you search, so there are some tools. And essentially, what you're doing is assessing the readiness of the organization as to how digital ready are they from top down. Will they embrace the digital change? So you will look at people, practices, and systems. Are your systems stable? Do you need to replace them? Do you need to amend them? Should you be going for cloud-based systems, for example, or is it still appropriate to use on-prem for you? Developing the outline. So if I just focus on that bullet point, so what's key here that I've added, and it's something that might often be forgotten, but it's so key, right, is the customer journey and the personas. And by personas, what I mean here is that you may, for example, want to characterize someone in your one of your customers or typical customer. So let's say, for example, we give this customer a name. So the name is Sally. So Sally normally wakes up at 8 a.m., turns her laptop on, gets onto some Zoom calls. She then goes on to do her online shopping for groceries, perhaps. Later in the afternoon, might be purchasing some items such as the kind of things you purchase from Amazon, perhaps, a book, a device. So if you map out the persona for your customer, then the digital strategy or digital technology you're trying to introduce could be mapped against that persona as to how will my customer use this service that I'm offering? What will they do? Where will their touch point be, etc. So what else is here? I think I mentioned the optimize and automate already. So I will move on from this slide. I think we've covered it, but hopefully this gives you a guide, guidance, a framework for the items you should be looking at in any digital strategy that you're trying to bring about. So for any change, any digital strategy adoption, then good change management is of course key. And this isn't change management from an ITIL perspective. This is change management in that resistance curve that many of you will be familiar with. So where you have people who will initially be shocked by the change and they'll calm down. There may still be resistance, but then you'll have champions, and then you're on an upwards trajectory as as people start becoming familiar with the change. So any of that kind of good change management practice that you'll be familiar with will have to be key to your your digital strategy adoption. Another technique that I'd encourage you using are where you'd map your stakeholders and customers. So you may have a quadrant, as an example, a box of 4, where and I've just given some examples here of champions, influencers, blockers, important people. You can use whatever terminology is right for you. Essentially, you map your stakeholders and customers to these boxes, and then depending on what you're doing and what stage of your program you're at, you would address those people indifferently, right? So if you have blockers, people are going to stop you bringing about that change. You may, I don't know, do a face-to-face session with them, maybe if that was appropriate, or you give them more time or less time, so if they're huge blockers, then maybe they're less important. You don't give them too much time. Whereas your champions, there's probably not much you need to do with them. You just need to keep them on board and keep them engaged with you. Okay, so mapping your stakeholders in any change, key. Of course, communicating, and educating and training people is also big factors that you need to consider. And then just moving on slightly, you'll see here that I've got example models of the types of transformation that you might do. I've got 4 headings, and these are covered in the course, by the way. So you may do a large-scale transformation, right? So absolutely, and then that's because you've got a huge threat. It could be something that's such as COVID that's brought about, some threat to you. If you're in the hospitality trade and you can't trade how you were trading, then you may have to completely change your business very quickly, go online if you weren't doing online, as an example. I know many restaurants have done that. Or it could be an opportunity in the market that you seize upon. But either way, you might want to do a fast, hard, large-scale transformation. If you're not in that situation and you want to evolve your digital strategy, then of course it may be incremental. It may be over a year, it may be over 2 years with achievements every 6 weeks, every 3 months, as an example. You may do it through mergers and acquisitions. So, if that's the kind of organization you're in, and whether you have that influence or not, or just for you to at least be aware of it. Of course, that's sometimes how organizations do it. They procure other companies. And then another form of digital strategy are the local grassroots changes. This is decentralized. This is people in the organization who are making changes locally. Now, in the olden days, I remember this was often being done with Microsoft Access. So if some of you have been around for 15, 20 years in the industry, there were often teams here and there, small teams, whether it's on the customer side, the client, the internal customer side, or wherever they were in the organization, bring about access databases, not backed up, not controlled. IT departments hated it, but it was happening. But they were always bringing about change. And then what would often happen is the IT department would see that the tool was useful, good, and would then perhaps bring it into Microsoft SQL, bring it into their enterprise system. But those local changes can help, do happen, and they're examples of where organizations or people will bring about digital change. And what I guess I'm saying here is, in these kind of digital strategy models, that shouldn't necessarily be discouraged. So I know traditionally we would discourage that, but I think for innovation and change and that where it could come from anywhere, doing it locally just has as much merit as any of the other models. Now that's it. I hope you found that useful. We have approximately 18 minutes or so of this session to answer your Q&A. Kerry, are there any questions in the chat?
Yes, there are a couple of questions in the chat.
Kerry, I've just remembered. So I said that I would ask people to turn on their cameras, if I may, just so we can, get everyone to wave and have that recorded as part of the session. So if you all don't mind, I'd really appreciate you just turning on your cameras for 10 seconds, just doing a wave, especially if you've enjoyed what, you're the ones who've stayed on. If you've enjoyed what you've heard, then that would be great. So I really appreciate that. Thank you for those of you that have done it. So yes, so we can go back to the questions now.
Okay, so let's see. First of all, Ranjini, sorry. So that was a question around the training side, wanting to know actually if the courses such as ITIL or Agile, if they do their training through their own training platform, instead of going through the training providers that are out there, like my own one, which is the better option? So is it more, are you going to get more of an edge if you have a paid certification from a recognized third party versus having something from your own organization? I did actually respond to that one because I am an ATO.
Okay. Great. So let me just mention it briefly. Yeah. So let me cover that briefly, and as you said, you've already responded, so that's great. So look, I think if finances aren't an issue, then of course you should do the formal course qualification. Not only will you learn from an accredited instructor, such as Kerry, but it does look good on the CV, and actually part of it is also networking with peers. Right? So if you go on an accredited course, there's other people who have the same mindset as you. That's just as valuable as anything, right? Just learning from peers. So of course I'd encourage that. But if finances are an issue, if getting certified isn't a huge deal for you, then of course just being on sessions like this, hopefully, where you look at material or the content that you find online, of course it's still good. But yes, I would encourage certification and accredited courses where possible. Okay.
And also just to bear in mind, everyone, for your own personal interest, if you're thinking of self-study, there are some strict rules around AXELOS and gaining certification through self-study. So it's worthwhile actually visiting their site to see what their rules are.
Yeah. Great.
Next question, Rajendra. So Rajendra, just so that everybody that was late joining asked the question on whether the deck will be available through email. So everyone, the session is being recorded and will be available on both LinkedIn and YouTube. And Alim, I believe that we are sending out via email the link for those to all the attendees.
Yes, we are. So you will all receive an email with those, and we can also post those links in the chat in a bit as well. So that's fine. But yes, you will receive the recordings afterwards.
Let's see. Vikas. So Vikas K asked the question, would companies going through digital transformation be open for remote working with on-site meetings when needed, given the push is towards using digital tools for communication?
Okay, great question, right? So I think, of course, it depends on the organization, but those ones that are really embracing digital, I think would actively encourage their people to actually work remotely and digitally. And I've heard about some organizations, I think it was Twitter was one, I think Google have done it now, they've actually said, I think it's Twitter, let me use that as an example, and I hope I'm not giving them too much credit if it's not them, but I think they've said that in the year 2020, as an example, they are not expecting anyone to come to the office. So they're expecting everyone for the next 6 months at least to be working from home, even if they could come to the office. And if someone chooses to come to the office because they just feel they need to get away from the kids, whatever their reasons are, then of course that facility will be there with some of these organizations. But yes, absolutely. I think the forward-thinking organizations will actively push for people to be working from home, at least for a while. And I think, COVID, as terrible as it is, from a digital IT perspective, I think it's brought about change that I can't see us going back away from, right? So I think in many countries, it's now set a new landscape.
Yeah, and I read an article the other day, and it mainly tended towards retail, but they reckon we've leapt about 5 years forward in terms of like digital communications and things like that.
Yeah, completely agree. And for a long time, if I could just also add to that, so people for quite a long time now have been talking about virtual environments, right? And the like not holograms, but having the kind of the big glasses around your eyes and seeing your whole office virtually. Now, at the moment, it still seems far-fetched. It still seems like really everyone's going to be wearing these big goggles. They're going to see their colleagues like they're in a virtual environment. Well, remember, 15, 20 years ago, people talking about paperless offices was seen as crazy as well. And I know there are still offices that use paper, but it's becoming more and more real. So with what's happening right now, digital technology advancements, I can see perhaps in 10 years' time, maybe without big goggles, maybe there'll be chips implanted in us or something. But, for us to be able to see our colleagues virtually while we're at home, if it's another 10 years' time, will probably become a thing of reality sooner or later. But anyway, thank you for that question. Kerry, any others?
Yep, from Mohammed. Also, thank you, Mohammed. Mohammed has just said for the Indian cohort out of India is the ATOs in India for the ITIL courses virtually being offered at almost exam cost, worthwhile looking into if you happen to be based in India. So Mohammed has a couple of questions. First of all, given your experience with managing successful programs where PESTEL analysis is discussed, how different is the PESTEL analysis discussed between the MSP and the ITIL?
Okay, it's exactly the same. So it's exactly the same. So they're using PESTEL because if, you'll probably be aware, many of you will be aware, I think PESTEL has been around for about 40 or 50 years. So it's been around for a while, and it was MSP that adopted it from, some professor or doctor that wrote it 40, 50 years ago. And many frameworks and methodologies have adopted it. So ITIL 4 has adopted it in exactly the same way, in that, yes, you just need to analyze all the different environments that could impact your digital strategy. Okay. Actually, and on that note, one thing, slightly aside, but one thing that I didn't really emphasize too widely in my presentation, which I'd just like to do now, something that I found hugely interesting, thought-provoking, and has stuck with me from the course, is that before let me explain like this. Before I went on the course, I would have thought that there's a business strategy. So there's an organization strategy. And of course, there's an IT strategy underpinning that business strategy. And that's it, right? So the organization strategy and the IT strategy. What the course, this ITIL 4 course emphasizes is that you need a third strategy, which I wouldn't have considered, but the more we got into it, the more it made sense. So you'd still have your organization strategy, you'd still have your IT strategy, but you should also separately have a digital strategy. And the digital strategy, of course, has interdependencies and needs to align with your IT strategy and your organization strategy, but that it should have its own focus, its own push, if you like, where the IT strategy typically would be on keeping the lights on, ensuring your technology, your email, these traditional IT tools are working, whereas your digital strategy is all about digital. So would have a separate leader. So you, just like in many organizations, you'd have a CIO, okay, for your IT area. You might then have a D something O, a digital head of officer, or whatever title they use. Now, of course, it could be the same person. Okay, of course, it could be your CIO that is accountable for both. But it's something that you should at least consider, that for an organization to truly adopt digital, they may have to have a different leader. They may have to have a different focus to really push the digital agenda. Okay. So Kerry, actually Kerry, before we take any other questions from the chat, I know we have about 7 minutes left. So let me see if there's anyone who wants to unmute themselves and ask a question directly, or on a follow-up question or a new question.
Well, seeing as Mohammed has just posted another question, go on, Mohammed.
Yeah, hi. Hi, Alim.
Can you speak up a little bit, Mohammed?
Yeah, I'm audible now.
Very, very briefly, Mohammed.
Okay.
Oh, that's better. That's better.
Okay. So my question is, this digital strategy you're talking about, is it for both employees and customers, or is just for customers and then employees are taking care in different ways? Is it something like kind of provide more emphasis on only on the customers?
Yeah. Okay. So great question. So let me answer that by saying that the course and what most people would be focused on would traditionally just be their own organization, right? So what you can control. So your digital strategy for your organization, new services you want to introduce, a new business you want to create, whatever it might be. However, as part of the service offering that you're providing, you may also need your customer to work differently and to consume your service differently, because they need to work with you, right? They need to be able to interact with you, use your tools, your digital solution, etc. So actually a large part of the course, and something that I've mentioned earlier about ITIL 4, is about co-creation, creating value with your internally with your customer, your partners and your suppliers. So if you can, where appropriate, get your customer involved, especially if you're doing something significant, a significant change, then absolutely, and your customer may need to change as well. But really it's what you can control, and it's your internal organization.
Because when you say customer experience, enhancing that through digital transformation or adoption. So it's always employee first and customer next. So how are our employees empowered here in this particular scenario?
So I didn't fully understand I can't fully hear you, but definitely employees, internal organization first. But do you remember I mentioned there was a balanced approach? If I mention on one of the slides, which I'll go back to, let me just see where it was. I think it's the second bullet point from the bottom. So you need a balanced approach. You need to focus on the customer and their journey, absolutely. But of course, if your internal organization, your operational excellence cannot support what you're doing, then it is going to fail. And let's take Zoom as an example, right? We're using Zoom. And many of you will know that a lot of the publicity around Zoom was it's insecure, it's not focused on the customer. Yes, the customer loves it, but their data might get out, etc. So they had to both focus on the confidence of the customer and what the customer was going to use, and the fact that the customer needed to update their application and how they use Zoom, make the interface easy, etc. But also ensure that the security, the capacity, the people supporting Zoom internally were also at the level that they needed to be. So that's an example where it needs to be both the customer and the internal organization.
Okay, so one last question around change management and adoption. So, is there any recommended way to address the cultural issues, because you're talking about resistance and stuff like that? So it's more from a reinforcement perspective. So that's where you come across a lot of cultural issues. So is there any kind of recommendations made as part of it?
So Mohammed, I have to apologize, but a lot of that question I didn't get. You were breaking up. So can I, if you don't mind, can I please ask you to post it in the chat, and I will try and pick it up afterwards. So apologies if it was just me.
No problem. No problem.
Kerry, is there anything else from the chat, any other questions that I can answer?
No, only Mohammed's question around that change management side.
So if you
that related more to some of the methodologies and frameworks that might potentially be used to undertake that cultural shift. Now, I believe that there is a change management session also as well over the course of the next 5 days or so.
There is. Yep. Kerry, so thanks for mentioning that.
Can you remember what day that's on?
I will, Monday. It's Monday. So yes, so thank you, Kerry, for pointing it out, because I wouldn't have necessarily remembered. So if you are interested in that change management, stakeholder engagement side of how you bring about change, there is a session on Monday, which still has a few spaces left, which you can register for if you haven't already, using the same way you registered for this session. So Mohammed, so even though I can't, I haven't answered your question necessarily, hopefully on that session we can pick it up. I'll also, before, we see if there's any other questions, I'll also mention again that there is a session on certifications, ITIL 4 certifications. I know there was a lot of questions around that prior to the session starting and in the session. So we can pick up any certification questions in tomorrow's session around ITIL 4 certifications, which you can register for as well if you choose. Kerry, any other questions?
No, that was all of them.
Okay, perfect. So look, thank you everyone. Thank you for joining. I hope you found it beneficial. And that is digital and IT strategy. So I will see you on a future session. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Alim.
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.
Namaste.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.